Hello, everyone. Welcome to our January 2026 webinar with Global Innovation Institute. My name is Anthony Mills. I am the Executive Director of GI&I, Global Innovation Institute. As most of you know, GI&I is the world's leading professional certification, business accreditation, and membership organization in the world of applied business innovation. And we host these webinars on a more or less monthly basis to help to continue to grow our community's broad knowledge of innovation practices and everything related to innovation. So we're very happy to have you with us here today. Today is, I believe, Wednesday, January 14th, 2026, and this is our January 2026 webinar. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce you to our guest today and tell you a little bit about her. And after I introduce her, I'm going to turn things over to her to take over our show. So our guest today is Miss Brianna Sylver. Brianna is a nationally recognized innovation strategist in the United States who helps Fortune 50 organizations and city governments unlock growth, align teams, and lead through complexity. She is the founder and president of Sylver Consulting, a global research and strategy firm that blends the disciplines of market research, user experience design, and business strategy to drive transformative change. Brianna is also the author of the book Leading Through Freefall: How Innovators Turn Turbulence into Trust, a practical guide for leaders navigating uncertainty, change, and team dynamics in high-stakes environments. Brianna's insights have been spotlighted by Forbes, Business Week, Fast Company, PDMA, QRCA, and HSM Management in Brazil. Known for her clarity and candor, Brianna delivers tools, not just talk, that help audiences take action. Brianna holds a BFA in Communication Design from the University at Buffalo and a Master of Design from the IIT Institute of Design at Illinois Institute of Technology. You can connect with Brianna on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/n/Brianna Sylver. Today, Brianna is going to be talking to us about this subject of leading through freefall and how to turn turbulence into trust. This is important to all of us because we often feel like we're constantly pushing the boulder uphill in our organizations. While we may have mastered every innovation framework in the book, if we can't navigate the emotional freefall that change triggers in our stakeholders, then our best ideas will simply die on the vine, something we obviously don't want. So Brianna is going to show us how to prevent that. And so with that, I will now turn it over to Brianna. Join me, if you will, in welcoming Miss Brianna Sylver. Brianna, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Well, I'm so excited to be here with all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Are you seeing a screen now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, super. Let me just get things situated on my side. All right, super. Well, we are here to talk about leading through free fall, and specifically for each one of you, how do you look to turn turbulence into trust in your work? And so I first have a question, and I'd really invite everybody to answer this in the chat for me. When you think about your last innovation project, type into the chat your answer to this question. How impactful was that last innovation project on a scale of 1 to 5? So 1 being, it could have been a lot better. 5 was like, everything that we suggested was acted upon. So I'd like everybody to just put, how would you answer this question 1 to 5 in the chat? I got some 3s and some 4s coming in. Anybody else want to put any 4s? Okay, great. Got some answers there. Excellent. Well, I appreciate that. We got 3, a couple of 3s. So you can see nobody is putting 5, right? And the reason is that while it's our goal to create impact in our projects and in our initiatives, we did have 1 better put 5. More often than not, something prevents that link from insights into action from being forged. And so if you all are like me, at times you might feel like you're on a hamster wheel where you're questioning the value and the impact of your contributions. If you're getting questioned a lot and a lot of pushback and resistance, you might feel beaten down and run down by the constant need to defend your work. And then, over time, that can leave you pretty tired and just questioning if you want to keep moving forward. I know a lot of people in my own personal network have left, sort of the insights and innovation world as a result of feeling just beaten down and trodden down because of that resistance. And so, but the thing is the problem is not really your project, nor is it your process. It's really the emotional undercurrents in and around your projects that you're just frankly trained to ignore. We often don't talk about these things. We're hyper focused on the surface mechanics of our work or talking about the process. But underneath every single one of our projects are emotions that really extend out much further than what you can see on the surface. And it's those emotions of your stakeholders, your team, and yourself that really start to undermine and sort of and dampen that impact that we were talking about. And so the reality is when you fail to acknowledge these emotions, they can sink your project and frankly your impact, leaving even the most robust and rigorous initiative kind of bobbing in the water. And so this leaves us to the next question, which is, who has experienced delivering a robust initiative to then have absolutely no action taken from your stakeholder teams? So this is a rhetorical question for you to kind of like answer in your mind right now. But my guess is if you're saying, yeah, that has happened to me, it's emotions like anxiety and fear and resistance to change that has ultimately prevented your stakeholders from taking action. It's not the quality of your recommendation or the next steps that you've offered, or even the robustness of the insights that you have delivered or the data that is suggesting that change. And so the reality is when you start to think about this and what does this mean for you going forward, I really want you to view the emotions that you receive back from your stakeholders, whether they're positive or negative. I want you to receive each of those as gifts, not as obstacles to push through. Because the reality is that when emotions present themselves, it usually means that you're on the brink of transformative change. Yet, we often internalize those emotions, particularly that pushback and that resistance, as hits to our own competence as leaders. And the reality is that couldn't be further from the truth. And so to illustrate this, I want to introduce you to the Kubler-Ross change curve. So the Kubler-Ross change curve teaches us that people go through a grief curve when they're faced with change. And so as innovation professionals, we are change makers. I mean, that is part of our job description. And that means that your teams and your stakeholders are going to go through a lot of negative emotions when it comes to receiving your insights and recommended next steps before they're often ready to take action. And so it's normal for you to experience denial, that resistance of why do we actually even need to do this? Or the anger of like, I don't think that this is right. We did something wrong. We brought the wrong people in. We haven't looked at the data well enough. Somebody needs to reprocess it. To them bargaining of trying to figure out, well, how much do we really need to change? Can we change this and then that would be okay? To then getting to the point of depression and feeling that overwhelm, that anxiety, feeling defeated, before you ultimately get to a place where you're willing to engage in experiments and then start to feel a sense of hope and empowerment and acceptance towards the change that's being proposed. So this is kind of a negative and kind of like, stinky to be in, and in a way, because it's like, oh, we have to go through all of this negative emotion before we get to the positive. But the good news is that every project that you have is going to go through this change curve. And so that means it's a predictable process that you can lead people through with intention. Now, depending on the project and the people who are part of it, people are going to travel this change curve at different rates. Some people who are a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity are going to travel it faster. Bigger transformative projects for organizations are going to travel it slower. So it just depends on the people and the scale of the initiative, but every single project goes through it. And so the call for each of you then today is to accept that it's your job to lead the emotional energy of your team and your stakeholders and yourself through this. And so doing this is going to hone your ability to spot and navigate the emotional inflection points in your projects, ensuring that your insights ultimately drive to the transformation and the change that you seek of them versus getting buried, stuck, or sunk. And so the good news is, as Anthony teed up at the start, I've written a playbook to help you in doing just this. So this guide steps you through 3 stages of insights leadership. Suiting up, which is all around how to consciously set up your projects for success. So these are the intentional things that you can do that are going to give you alignment from the start, as well as anchor points to come back to as you travel through an initiative. The free fall, this is all the stuff that comes out of left field. You could never predict it. You just are stuck with basically reacting to it, but you have a choice of how do you react to it. And so this is about how to navigate resistance with clarity and resilience as you go through initiatives. And then the third section of the book is called The Safe Landing. And this is how to empower implementation partners and ensure that your innovations ultimately thrive. So in this book, you'll find 17 powerful tools. Each are designed to help you shine light on the anxieties, the misalignments, the doubts, and the fears that silently sink each of your projects. And so in our time today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share 2 of these tools with you. Both of them are coming from the suiting up section of the book that I just discussed. And they're meant to really support you and your teams to set your project up for success. So the first one that we're going to talk about is adopt an inquiry-based project scoping script. And this is all about being able to scope with your eyes open full. And so I'm going to set up the situation just so you can kind of understand it contextually, how it can play into your projects, and then share the tool itself. So the situation in this case, building from, just in terms of like how it would fit into your world, we've kind of all been here. A new project lands on your desk. The team sharing this new project with you does so with a lot of declarative language. They come into that meeting, whether it's in person, virtual, they know what the problem is, and then they know what the solution is before you even been invited to the conversation. But the reality is, and this is the question, is to say, do they really know what the problem is? And do they really know what the solution is? The reality is no, otherwise they wouldn't be calling you, right? Yet, their declarative statements and the convicted energy that they bring to that meeting, because just as humans, we try to make something that feels ambiguous, concrete. And the way that people do that is to project problems and solutions onto situations. So they come with these declarative statements and convicted energy, and that's going to trick your brain. It doesn't matter how tenured you are as an innovator, it's going to trick your brain into thinking that they do. And so the mind shift that I'm suggesting for each and one of you is to really resist the urge to be an order taker in this situation and specifically commit to being a question asker. Your stakeholders have been living this challenge. They've been immersed into this situation longer than you have. And so it's easy at this moment in time to say, well, they kind of know. I just have to kind of trust that they're leading me in the right direction. And they may, but it's also very likely that they are bringing blind spots into this conversation that ultimately, if you do not lean in with a healthy dose of skepticism, could have you all walking down a path that is not going to lead to the fruitful end that you all hope it to be. So in this case, I'm asking you to be a question asker, and I'm going to show you how this comes to life in the context of a case study from my own prior work. So the situation is this. My organization, Sylver Consulting, we were approached by NASA, specifically the International Space Station planning team. So they had recently built a digital whiteboard. This was before actual digital whiteboards existed, like online, but it was a full standing digital whiteboard meant to really enhance collaboration among the different agencies involved in the space station. So basically, whatever anybody wrote on the whiteboard here in the US would get projected in Russia or in Japan or wherever else it would be in terms of the International Space Station partnerships. But once that whiteboard was put into implementation, they found that it sat dormant into the corner of each conference room in which the International Space Station teams in the respective countries were working. No one was using it. And so when they brought us in, they came in and they said, we have a usability issue on this whiteboard. In the RFP, it had framed the project that they wanted my organization to support them on as a product usability test. Yet as we started to get into scoping conversations, we realized that, there was something a little off. So they wanted to design a study that would identify new features that could be built into the whiteboard. And they were convinced in this case that new features would ultimately increase the adoption of this whiteboard, which then would increase the collaboration between the agencies involved in the International Space Station. But my spidey senses were turned up a bit because as they shared more about how this whiteboard came to be, I learned that the whiteboard itself, all the specifications for it, were actually designed and created by the NASA engineers themselves. So I was like, I think they kind of know what a product capability would be here. Like that there's something around this that feels a little off. And I had also used the whiteboard and it felt pretty intuitive. It worked the way that one would expect it to. So as I started to probe more using the questions that I'll walk you through in a second, a different story started to take shape. So I leaned into that inquiry-based project scoping script. And what emerged was that this project was not about usability. It was about collaboration. And what we needed to understand was what collaboration meant to these International Space Station planners. And we needed insights on workflow and process, not tool interaction. And so ultimately what we ended up doing was we shifted the whole project to be about how do we better enable collaboration of the partners of the International Space Station versus what new features do we build into the custom built digital whiteboard. But the reality is we would have never gotten there had we not led with the inquiry-based project scoping script that I'm going to walk you through right now. So this is a tool that you can start to put into place in your work, even as early as this afternoon. So the script has 4 key questions to it, and each question builds on one another. So the first is, what do you want to learn or accomplish through this project? So in many cases, teams might coming to you, at least in many cases for me, there is already some type of brief written on paper about what do they want to do. I still want you to ask this question, even if that exists, because you want your project stakeholders to communicate in their own words what the project is about. And it's super telling to you as an individual with deep listening skills to hear what is coming back to you and basically what they are choosing to paraphrase and summarize in verbiage versus what exists on the paper, because that already starts to give you a sense of hierarchy of what really matters to them in this initiative. Then the second question is, so what's led your team to focus on this initiative now? What business decision is the organization trying to make as a result of this work? So this is oftentimes missing in many RFPs. And so you really want to drill into the specifics of the project topic area and its connection to the broader organization. You want to really understand how what they are asking your team to do is going to lead to the business goals that they have for the broader organization. Then the third question is, what is holding you back today from making the business decisions that you want? So what information or insight do you need that you currently don't have? And this is about exploring the gaps in understanding, especially the gaps that your stakeholder perceive that are holding them back from successfully making those decisions. And then the fourth question is, so how does gaining that insight help you and your team move forward towards your broader business goals? And so this is really about identifying ultimately what the clarity outcome looks like for them in this initiative, and really getting very pinpoint on kind of what is success, right? So these questions are fairly simple and straightforward, and yet they're oftentimes really, really hard to ask in the moment. And they're hard to ask because of that convicted energy. Your stakeholders have come in and they've said, this is our problem, this is our solution, we just need your support in doing it. And you're wanting to really sort of pump the brakes and say, okay, let's just engage in these conversations and see what comes forward. And so once you do, you then are in a position of not challenging what they want, but just trying to understand. And the goal for you in this situation is just accept nothing at face value. Now, I want to kind of round back to that case study that I shared just to show you kind of the impact of this. So I'd already told you that we basically moved away from a usability study into that workflow and process study. But what that shared is that what we learned is that a fractured workflow was ultimately what was impeding collaboration across the International Space Station partners. It wasn't, the use or not use of this digital whiteboard. They had 7 core systems, and none of them spoke to one another. And so there was a lot of integration challenges that were causing rework and, frankly, just wasting a lot of time for folks. And so actions that ended up coming out of that work, the recommendations was to take the money that they had put towards, further improvement of this digital whiteboard, and then starting to direct that money into specific improvements of the other 7 systems. And so through the course of the work, we were able to create the whole roadmap of how the improvements to those systems would happen over time, and how the budgeting and timeline from resource perspective would also pace out over that roadmap. And then ultimately what ended up happening was, significant increases to collaboration across the International Space Station agencies. At the time this project was going on, it's when ESA and JAXA were coming into the fold of the space station. And so there was just a lot that had to be ironed out, and it really helped with a smoother onboarding for all of those agencies coming in. And so the key takeaway of this particular tool case study is just don't be an order taker. Please, please lean in with a healthy dose of skepticism and be a question asker. Now, the second challenge that I'm going to bring you through, or the second tool, is around surfacing the innovation baggage. And this is really about using past experiences to really direct the future of where you and your organization want to go. So the situation here is that, in some organizations, I'm sure you all have experienced this to some degree, innovation can be kind of a dirty word, right? Everybody has some baggage associated with it, whether it's positive or negative or a mix. And oftentimes it evokes commentary like, well, yeah, we've done this project before and it didn't work. How is this going to be any different, right? And so people are already coming into the situations in which many of you are leading with a lot of skepticism and pushback for you. And so the reality is that if you let this innovation baggage fester, it really ends up manifesting as anxiety, fear, self-doubt, avoidance, and distorted thinking on the projects that you're leading. You're not starting your initiative with a fresh start. You're starting it with the shadow of all the negative energy that people have towards innovation overall. And so my challenge for you today is bring this innovation baggage into the light. And the tool of treasure, trash, hope, fear, which I'm going to walk you through, is going to support you in knowing exactly how to do that. But before we get there, let me put this in the context of a project again. So in this particular case study, my organization was working with a pet food company. So we were hired to facilitate their 7th annual Innovation Summit. It was a multi-day ideation event designed to develop new products for their pipeline. In summits of previous years, not facilitated by our team, while seen as successful in the moment, as months went by and that pipeline started to be executed, ultimately had a shadow of just sort of providing lackluster results. And so ultimately, the stakeholders coming into this project, while they were putting up the money and the budget to do it again, they were coming in sort of questioning if the outcomes of this year's summit would be any different. So they basically were not coming in with full positive energy, which is certainly not a good way to start anything, right? So the real story here is that it was clear that all of this innovation baggage from these 6 other summits needed to be cleared as it was weighing down sort of how people could really hook in and commit themselves for what was ahead in the summit that we were going to be leading. And so we ultimately then ended up using that treasure, trash, hope, fear exercise that I'm going to walk you through in a minute to really use the past experiences of the team to really process those so that we could direct a more promising and hopeful future for the current innovation summit that we were executing. And so we knew that if we just sort of let this baggage just kind of exist, if it was left unaddressed, it would ultimately support our stakeholders only half-heartedly engaging in the summit. So in the intent to basically unburden them of this emotional weight and ultimately turbo boost the output of our upcoming initiative, we said, let's do a treasure, trash, hope, fear exercise. Now, this is something that can be done in like 30 to 60 minutes, depending upon the size of the team. So it's not a super time intensive exercise, but it is an incredibly clarifying exercise. So what it looks like is you start by asking people, what do you treasure about how the organization, in this case, how the organization has approached innovation in the past? And specifically, what do you want to hold on to or further build upon from last year's summit? So you can use this framework that I'm walking you through in anything. Obviously, my examples are going to be grounded in that innovation summit, just because that's what the case study is here that I'm using as demonstration. But literally, it can be like, what do I treasure about how I was a leader last year, right? And you can kind of put whatever you want on the backside of that. So in this case, though, what do you treasure about how the organization has approached innovation in the past? And what do you want to hold on to or further build upon in this year's summit? And so the team in this case started to share that they treasure all the equity that they have with their retailers, and specifically the history that they had of creating really high quality products that were, of course, appreciated by those retailers. The next question gets to that trash. So what do you want to trash or discard, and what didn't work that you don't want to repeat? So when we dove into this questioning, they really revealed that they wanted to let go of all the red tape that prevented speed in their organization. They wanted to stop evaluating ideas based on their comfort level and presenting them to big box retailers. And they wanted to drop the desire to be perfect, which often in their case led to overanalysis and paralysis. As we moved into hope, the question was, what do you hope this year's summit is going to yield for the organization? And the team expressed here, hopes for greater speed to greater speed to market. And then they also were starting to explore a new sales model to test new products. They really wanted to be able to expand outside of the core of their portfolio, but were concerned about how that was going to impact retailer relationships. So they really wanted to, start to explore a new sales model to test new products. And then lastly, the fear question, what fears or concerns do you have about stepping into the summit experience again? And in this case, their fears were pretty profound. So, I mentioned that they really wanted to step outside of their core product offering. And they really worried, like, could their brand stretch into the broader pet care category? If they did and they made a mistake, what would that do to their retailer relationships? How would that impact the core of their business? They were also really concerned about losing control if they used outside formulators, which ultimately was a huge constraint in how much they could really experiment. And so all these things that they had never put voice together as a whole leadership team really started to come to the fore. And so the impact of confronting this baggage at the front end of this summit was, one, we learned that there was a bunch of institutional truths that were ultimately keeping our clients stuck. So they insisted that all manufacturing of all products had to happen in-house. There was a lack of clarity on brand strategy for new categories that they were trying to expand into as an org. And they were stressed by supply chain shortages and just being too risk averse as a result of that. And so what this exercise did, is it really helped to bring all the baggage that they had around all these issues out into the open and into the light. And now that it was in the open, it meant that dialogues could continue around them. So in some cases, things that came out, we could take on, as people who are executing this innovation summit to say, okay, we can make this shift in execution and, support this outcome differently. In other cases, there was nothing that we could do on that initiative per se, but it like opened up the space for conversation for people to challenge or even start to process it differently over time. So the result though was that in this case it was a 30-minute conversation, and it really saved the summit. Coming out of this, there was a new project pipeline that ultimately ended up launching a whole new division of the organization. And so it really changed, like that 30 minutes completely changed the trajectory of the product, and more importantly, supported the organization to really make real an explicit goal that they had, which was to break outside of the core product areas that they were already working in. And so the key here for you is to just, bring that innovation baggage into the light, be committed in doing that. Before I open it up to questions, I just want to do a little bit of a recap before we wrap here. So the first and foremost takeaway that I want you to come away from today is it is your job to lead the emotional energy of your teams, your stakeholders, and yourself through the change curve. You're called in that process to embrace all the emotions as that you receive on a project as gifts, not roadblocks. So even that pushback and resistance, how do you accept that as a gift to say, where do I need to lean in with my stakeholders in a meaningful and intentional way? Which, of course, the tools that I just walked you through are 2 of the 17 that are involved in this book. And then also have freedom in adapting the tools shared, both those shared today, and then if you choose to buy the book, those that are there. Adapt them to really liberate your projects for greater business impact. Now, I've got a free gift for all of you today, and that is that I'm offering a free chapter of the book, specifically the chapter 6, which goes into that treasure, trash, hope, fear exercise that I just walked you all through. So if you scan this QR code on the screen here, you'll get access to that. And that'll give you the full detailed script of how to facilitate that. Each chapter of the book, just so that you're aware, sort of sets up the challenge, sets up a case study from my career related to it, gives you the challenge, and then actually gives you the facilitated scripts or discussion guides to support how to move through that challenge, and then reframe sort of like what the mindset shift should be. And so with that, I want to open it up to questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Brianna. Yes. And so if you have questions, let's start by having you put them into the chat window. Any questions or comments you want Brianna to address. If you want to join on the mic and ask a question, let us know. Raise your hand. We can do that for sure too. Let me just start it out with a kind of a question or so of my own, and then we'll get to some of the other questions. So, Brianna, it seems like, at least in the NASA case study you're sharing with us, a lot of times you go into an engagement, and so much of it is, are we even addressing the right problem? We have to completely reframe the problem. So my question for you is, historically, in all your engagements, in what percentage of the cases have you had to completely reframe the problem? Is it like 50%, 100%? I don't know.
That is a really great question. To completely reframe the question, similar to like what was the NASA case, I would say maybe like 30-40% maybe.
Okay, so it's a significant number. Yeah,
it's a significant number, but even in the other 60 to 70%, I would say, even though it may not be full on reframes, there's almost no project that those questions don't uncover something that I hadn't understood initially from an RFP. And so it could be like, oh, you know what? You approached me and this was like positioned as a value proposition project, but it's not just a value proposition project. Like, you're wanting a marketing strategy out of that too. Or, so it's like, and so it either supports the actual like scoping of it. I think also a lot of times those questions show what the stakeholder engagement process should look like throughout an initiative as well. So I would say 100% of the projects that I work on get changed because of those. It's just whether there's a full-on pivot, like there's a completely different thing that
Right.
doesn't happen on every single
Yeah.
project.
So it sounds like there's always at least some amount of scope change or reframing
100%.
involved, and which is I think is great because it shows that as humans, especially when we're inside of organizations and we're too deep inside of immersed inside of a particular situation, to have some fresh eyes come in from the outside and look at it often helps us to like back out, zoom out a little bit and take a fresh look at things and reframe the problem a little bit, which I think is always like a perfect starting point and is a great starting point. So I'm glad to hear that. My other question, and then I'll go to some of the questions we have from our audience is, a lot of times when we talk about this whole concept of stakeholder management, what we try to encourage people to do, and I want to get your comments on this, is try to understand your stakeholders with them. They're what's in it for me, right? What motivates these different stakeholders, and then try to reframe what you're trying to do in the context of that particular motivator. Like so you want to offer all stakeholders. There's something for everyone, right, so to speak. So does that come into play in some of your frameworks here?
It does. Actually, in that safe landing section of the book, there's a whole chapter around this.
Hmm.
Um, and because I think one thing that leaders mistake is engagement in a project along the way doesn't mean that they have commitment to implementing what comes out of that initiative later,
Hmm.
right? And I think the way to get that commitment is exactly what you're saying, Anthony, right? Like what do they care about? How
Hmm.
have their goals been formed and being reported to their superiors, whether it's
Hmm.
their like their boss or just sort of like their business unit, right? Like what's the actual language they're using to articulate what they're going after that year, and then
Hmm.
how do you basically what's the contribution of your projects and its outcomes to that. Like in my work, a lot of times we're doing a lot of front end stuff, right? And so when that stuff is done, it's not like the teams who need to do the execution have been sitting there waiting for that work to hit their docket, right? Like they've got usually roadmaps that are already like stuffed packed full for the next 3 years. And so like
Hmm.
how do you also so one, it's about how do you frame it so that it has relevance, but then also how do you take what's new coming in to what's already on that roadmap, and then looking at the goals to say what's going to help us to get there faster. And so there's a whole workshop that we run. It's mentioned in the book with some scripts to support that. It's called a Go Forward workshop, and it's all around that of like, okay, now that you've got this thing that's new, obviously everybody thought it made sense to support that project,
Hmm.
financially, resource wise, or whatever. So there's interest in what comes out of it, but now you have to balance what came out of that with what's already there to figure out where do you put that execution resources, because you can't just keep anding and layering on and layering on. You got to make some choices and some trade-offs. So 100% agree with that. And I think early on in my career, and I see this all the time, you start to think like, oh, if I can engage them all the way through, they will commit in the end. And that's just not true.
Right. Yeah. To get that ownership, you have to really understand what motivates them, what their goals and aspirations are, and what matters to them. And that becomes sort of to use certain language, that becomes the lever you pull to
Yeah.
get them to own it and take it and execute it and make it happen. So anyway, let's shift over to some of the audience questions. So William Santos from Brazil would like to know, how can we work around or operate in cultures that are extremely traditional or closed to innovation?
Yeah. So this is about defining what innovation means. So, like, innovation is a word that it can mean anything, right? It can mean from like, I'm going to create the next breakthrough thing that's going to change the industry and change how everybody sees our company, to then, something as like, if you're doing like, consumer packaged goods, we're going to, create a new flavor. right? And everything in between. And so I think one of the things that one perspective I've always had is focus less about the scale of the innovation and more about people taking a next step. So that's first and foremost, because as people take steps, those steps in accumulation do make leaps. So one piece is just, kind of framing the type of innovation that you want. The other thing is, and William, in the book specifically, there's a chapter in the suiting up section that is all around defining innovation ambition. Because the other thing that oftentimes will happen is people will say, and I do see this a lot in these traditional and closed to innovation cultures that you're talking about, is they'll start off an initiative and say, we want innovation, right? And as you start to really explore what is the type of innovation they want, they might say, well, we want game-changing innovation, or we want to like they will put that in that. So this innovation ambition matrix tool that we have, it types the type of innovation. It puts it into 3 different areas that they would be sort of seeking, and it gets stakeholder teams to align on the breadth of the innovation ambition that they have. And so that plays 2 different levels. One, it helps to right size and align people up front of what is that, because oftentimes I've seen a mismatch between innovation leaders getting really excited when that word innovation comes out. And they see and they perceive it as breakthrough innovation, and then somebody else is understanding it as incremental innovation, and then the whole execution goes towards breakthrough, and then everybody's unhappy at the end, right? And so it aligns on the front end of the type of innovation, so that you're making sure that you're, channeling energies appropriately. But the other thing that it does is it provides an anchor point later. And so we had a client, for instance, that they were very traditional, very close to innovation overall, I would say, but they were feeling a lot of pressure within their industry and within their business. And so they had to break out of that traditional structure. So we had done this up front. We had defined that, they were sort of in the mid ground of their innovation ambition. It was like, okay, great. And then as we started to execute the project, it was a multi-phase over the course of like a year. When we got into month 6, when we're really needing to start to define what do we do to move forward, they started choosing all the incremental things to move forward. And so that level of expression for the innovation ambition matrix allowed us to then come back to it and say, hey, what we are choosing to push forward from these ideation sessions is not actually game-changing innovation. So has something changed internally and we need to change our understanding going forward? Or are you all backsliding into what feels comfortable in your risk adverse sort of mentality, and we need to push you outside of your comfort zone? And so that's another value of that ambition matrix, is it makes it so that wasn't a contentious conversation, where it could have been if we had not had that up front, but it just really became this anchor point that we could come back to and say, this is what you said you wanted a few months ago. What's changed that this is no longer what you want? Or do we just need to lean in a different way than what we have been leaning in? And so ultimately it did force them to say, yeah, you're right. Okay, we need to step outside of our comfort zone. And we started to explore some things there, and that created some new product opportunities for them.
Yeah, good. I think you're right. It really gets down to sort of how you define innovation. I would add also, I think there's a structural element too, because all organizations at the end of the day are ultimately risk averse. I mean, I've never met an organization that wasn't risk averse.
Yeah, so
I
true.
worked in some of the largest Fortune 50 organizations before. And in innovation groups, and where we presented product managers with options like, okay, you can have these things, you can have these 20 things that are safe bets, or you can have this one big huge breakthrough, and they always go with the 20 safe bets because it's just the lower risk. So that's just an issue we run into in every organization. So some organizations address that structurally, where they set up different groups to do the big things, and they allocate different budgets up front, because
Yeah.
from a budgeting standpoint, if you got one budget and all the projects are competing against each other, the low risk projects always win. So
Yeah.
if you carve out a separate budget up front structurally and people to work on that, and you start that momentum structurally up front, sometimes that can help address the situation too. That
Yeah, I agree
way
with that.
you don't have A competing with B and competing with C. They're just different buckets, you know.
Yep.
But
Yep.
that may or may not work for every organization. So that's just an option, you know. Let's move on to Barbara's question. Barbara wants to know, do you have techniques for drawing out those on a team who might be reluctant to speak out? How to hear all the voices and not just the dominant personalities?
Yeah. So Barbara, every one of these tools that are in the book really are about that, and they do it in different ways depending upon the tool itself. Um, in so some cases it's like literally like you go around the room and every person has to give their point of view on it, like that it's not a, let's just respond to this question as a group of 20, but it's like, literally everybody has a point of view. In the facilitation of a lot of these exercises too, particularly when they're done in more of like a workshop type of setting, we will use small groups as a big piece of it too. So we're really intentional of like, what are the moments when this is really meant to be a full group discussion, because like if we don't have that, we're going to miss something in the cross functional like sort of builds on things, to then the smaller groups really then make it so that people can't hide. When it comes to facilitation and like virtual, because we do a lot of virtual facilitation as well as in-person facilitation, but in virtual facilitation really try to advocate for people to have cameras on. Some cultures like that's just the norm. Other cultures, the norm is to have no cameras on. But when you are facilitating, you can then start to see like, okay, this person seems to either be checked out, or they have a face of confusion, or maybe they're just like, they're just burning to say something, and that you want to kind of call on them to do that. So that's another. There's also a technique that we use externally with our clients, and it's called Lego Serious Play. And this is like an amazing innovation strategy making methodology. But what I love about that particular methodology is that you build the strategy for your business with Legos. And because of how that whole thing is facilitated, people are not able to not have a voice. And that particular methodology supports, kind of whatever the voice is of how you speak. So we've all been in those strategy sessions where you have, somebody who's speaking at the 10,000 foot view, and you got somebody speaking at the 100-foot view. And like, they just frustrate each other, right? It's like, can you get out of the weeds? Can you get down to something practical, right? And so the Lego Serious Play methodology that we use helps to like, it actually is beneficial when we have those different levels. But just because of the nature of how that process is facilitated, everyone single has a voice, and it's like literally impossible for one voice to dominate. So there's lots of different ideas, and totally would be happy to have another conversation with you, Barbara, around specific things. If there's like, context that you're like, how would I approach it in this? So if that's the case, feel free to reach out. I'd love to have an offline conversation with you.
Excellent. And Beatrice Wingo commented that I lead innovation work in a nonprofit, and the innovation baggage exercise really resonates with me. It's a prudent tool to help teams have a fresh start for newer projects. This has been a very helpful session. And so she's just commenting that.
Thank
I'm
you,
sure
Beatrice.
yeah, yeah. But I would agree with her, because how many organizations have we been in that there's just that what's the word I want to use? There's hurt, there's pain, there's damage. Baggage, I think, is a light word for it. I think sometimes it goes emotionally deeper than that.
Oh,
People have
totally.
felt rejection, and there's a lot of fear, and depending on the culture of the organization, there's just a lot of emotional baggage there, and sometimes an exercise like that can just help to lift the emotional baggage. So I'm sure you've seen that.
100%. And I think like every single one of these tools, it makes people feel heard and seen in
Yeah,
ways that they've not been felt, heard, or seen before.
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, one of the things that our clients will oftentimes say to us, very endearingly is like after we get done, they're like, gosh, that felt like business therapy. And they're like, can we do it again next week?
Yes, it is therapeutic. It is. And something I like about these exercises, they're very humanizing. And even going back to your prior answer about structural ways to engage everyone in the exercise, whether it's, by asking everyone to participate or using Lego Serious Play, they do tend to humanize the whole process and help us to get some of that baggage out of the way, they are therapeutic in that way. So absolutely. Here's a question from Andrew Foley. You can answer this however you want. He wants to know, what's the most interesting trash you have found in an organization?
Well, that is a good question. Um, Probably the most interesting trash has been the lack of alignment. Kind of this is what we say we want to do, but this is what our actions always say in separately, right? And so, that leads to a lot of that leads to an interesting dialogue after the fact, because in some cases we say we want to do something and then we don't do it. It's just because like structurally things are not set up for that, right? And then through that, through that treasure, trash, hope, fear, you start to identify the operational that challenges associated with it. And then it's like, and in a lot of those cases, it's more just, are you going to put money towards it and people towards it to make it happen, right? Like if those become like the critical barriers. In some cases, though, it's not that. And it is more about a lack of willingness to change on specific stakeholders or, company levels. And so then that's a completely different thing. So it becomes almost like an adaptive challenge of like, the operational technical challenges, those are easy to address. The people challenges are much harder to address. And so those ones, I actually really love that, because then now you're like, okay, how do we actually dismantle that? And usually it's about like, one, really getting underneath why is there that resistance to change. Sometimes it's just about, how do you move people through that change curve that I was talking about. Other times it's about other situational awareness things that have just not been put voice to. And once you start to do that, like we actually just led a workshop last week where this kind of came out of that treasure, trash, hope, fear exercise. And so then we started to take every single one of those things that had prevented action in the past and start to really understand the nuances of why that has not happened, and starting to deal with those. And it could be anything from just funding to technical system limitations to all these other things. And so we've now brought that down to what are the technical versus people challenges so that we can start to make traction in a meaningful way. So maybe not necessarily super juicy per se, but kind of interesting in terms of like, it's not an easy fix. But again, just by bringing voice into it all, it creates a new type of awareness for people to start to have dialogues about how to move things forward.
Yeah, I can only imagine that after you've done some of these, you've had to afterwards sit down with the leadership team that hired you and say, "Hey guys, we got problems. We got bigger problems we got to fix, right?"
Oh,
What
for
we
sure.
call in the U.S. a come to Jesus meeting, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And
yeah,
then there's also just the practice too of saying, what is ours to deal with in this project and what
yeah,
is not ours to deal with in that project, right? So like for instance, like the pet care example that I gave, wanting that new sales model wasn't part of our project, right? But it was something that was, through that treasure, trash, hope, fear, it came out as like, we probably need to have this to ultimately succeed in creating this, new adjacent pipeline that we desire. And so it took them a while. It took them a couple years to make that happen, but now they fully have that sales model down. But it wasn't even in their collective consciousness they really needed to do that until that exercise, right? So there's also just an act of like surrendering of like what is meant to be dealt with today, and then what is meant to be dealt with tomorrow or the next day, or whatever. Like, but it kind of like lays it all out on the table so that you're strategically making decisions of where to collectively put your energy versus not.
Excellent. All right, we got a few more questions I want to try to get through quickly here. So, Halfa Alan just wants to know, or she says, I notice that whenever I do a design thinking session, the only thing the audience is thinking about is if I say something, I'll look silly, so I don't want to speak. So there's that inhibition of looking silly. How do you try to overcome those inhibitions?
Yeah. So, one is just sort of setting that up from the start of like, we're all going to say, dumb things that don't move forward. Like, and we can't do anything different. Like I always tell this one example, actually, this is great. Uh, uh, we were running an innovation session. It was for a city, and they, they were having an issue with power lines snapping because of snow. And so, somebody said, oh, silly, like, well, we'll just have the bears climb to the top of the telephone poles and shake them, right? Which that is a dumb answer. But if you kind of just like take it as that, nobody will ever say that. But I'm like, somebody actually, had the guts to say that, right? And then using both, yes and thinking, like somebody said, okay, well, great. Well, how do you get the bear to climb up on top of the telephone pole? And then somebody said, oh, you put honey on top of the telephone pole. Okay, well, how do you put the honey on top of the telephone? And then somebody said, oh, well, we can use the helicopter to put the honey on top of the telephone pole. And then as soon as somebody said we could use the helicopter, that actually became the solution for addressing this issue, because then they were like, oh, we can just basically fly the helicopter close to the lines, and then the airflow will shake the snow from power lines. We never would have gotten to that solution had we not just led with this yes and thinking. So we always put some guardrails up front in these design thinking and ideation sessions, but I oftentimes share that particular example because it's such a great example of how something stupid actually became the breakthrough, like the key to the breakthrough for that particular city.
Very good. That's a great answer. Here's one from Muhammad Fad. He wants to know, what's the most interesting approach to start an effective innovation and questioning session, especially when the environment is emotionally intense? Maybe that's what exercise you've been talking about, or maybe you have some other ones that you've used.
Yeah, there's other ones too. It really depends, Mohammed, in terms of like what is the course, what is the source of the emotionally intense or sort of charged environment. So, and that's really how the entire book is structured, is like these 17 different emotionally charged situations that you could find yourself in. But I'll just share a couple others beyond those that I've already shared. So, we've been in situations where like, you know, people just really don't believe that you have value to offer to the situation. They don't want to be there. They're super skeptical, and so, and we have had some incredibly intense situations in that, where like literally like everybody the night before the workshop, declines coming. And then the president comes in and says, you will be there or else. And so you can imagine like, how people are coming into that room the next morning. Right. And so in that type of situation, we oftentimes would run what we call group loop exercises, which is to like literally put a pause to our agenda first thing in the morning, and it will be going around the room. And this is an example, Barbara, of where everybody has to have a point of view, and you basically say, we're going to go around the room 3 times, and you're going to answer the same question 3 times, and we're going to put every answer up on the board, and then we're going to go and we're going to talk about each one and how either the initiative that we are leading is solving that, or it's going to be pinned for, in this, in the case of something like this, for the president or the CEO or whoever, right, to deal with this differently. And so that question, it looks different depending upon the project, but one one that's referenced in the book is basically, why do you not want to be here? And literally going around 3 times, why do you not want to be here? Why do you not want to be here? Why do you not want to be here? And then you ultimately, have pages and pages of why people don't want to be here. And so in that particular example, 70% or so of the reasons why people didn't want to be there, we had already talked about, had already planned for in the execution plan, for the reasons why they didn't think. And this is an example of where the organization said they wanted things and then they didn't never delivered on those things, right? And so that's an example of just really meeting the skepticism where it's at. And then there's just lots of different examples, and each chapter takes a specific emotionally intense, challenging situation and shows you how to really meet stakeholders where they are in that moment and lead them through that in a graceful way.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, Brianna. Well, we have reached the top of the hour, and I just want to thank you and everyone else who has participated in this. We're going to wrap it up now, and thank you all for your participation. And apologize if I got background noise here. We have lawn work going on. But anyway, I just want to thank everyone. Brianna, particularly, I want to thank you for your support and participation and for your great insights. If any of you have additional questions that didn't get answered, feel free to try to reach out to Brianna online through LinkedIn or otherwise, and we'll be following up with the recording and so forth from this. So I want to thank everyone, and that concludes our webinar for today. We'll see you next month. Take care. All right.